We haven't seen one quite this as bad as what I'm going to say. Yes, you go to a consumer and you say, we're going to give you a $500 bonus, no, a $1,000 bonus. Right, here's the check. And then you fail to disclose to them in any way they understand that you're going to slap a $34,000 mortgage on their house. If any charlatan had done that, this committee would have nailed them. But that is exactly what the tax bill does. People are told they got a $1,000 bonus. A few of them did as a result of this tax bill. Some only got $500, most got nothing. But what wasn't mentioned was the $34,000, which is the share of the average family of five of the increase in the national debt. As to trade, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to send you the transcript of the hearing we did yesterday in the Asia Subcommittee. I'm going to be perhaps the one person in this room that says that Mr. Trump's focus on China has been a little too late, a little too hesitant, and a little too weak. We gave China MFN most favored nation status in the year 2000. When that happened, 2/3 of Democrats voted no. Now, Wall Street trotted out some economists who said that the increase from that MFN bill would only be, the increase in the trade deficit with China would only be $1 billion a year. 2/3 of Democrats were right. The Wall Street economists, bought and paid for, were wrong. They were off by a factor of 25,000%. And so I would hope that, and we have a chart behind you that shows the massive increase in the trade deficit with China since the beginning of this administration. But I do not think that anti-Trump Democrats, and on most things I'm anti-Trump, should change our position. 2/3 of us were right 18 years ago, and we are right today, and MFN should be provided to China only in the context of fair and free trade. Now something far less controversial. I want to thank you for your last appearance here when we talked about the U.S.-Armenia tax treaty. You made a commitment then that you'd have at least one tax lawyer spend 28 hours on the project, and that work has not begun, and it's not your fault. The Armenian government has had a lurch toward democracy and transparency that many of us applaud. Things are in a little bit of a state of tumult still in Yerevan. I'm assured that when things calm down, the Armenian government will approach us committed to the kinds of transparency that our model tax treaty calls for, and then I'll hold you to the 28 hours. As a matter of fact, that 28 hours was based on the fact that 28 members of Congress have asked you to do that. It's now up to 31, so I may ask for another 3 hours. Marijuana, legal in a lot of states. I hope that you would act so that the activities of the Treasury Department don't mess up the economies of those states, whether it be large amounts of cash being moved around, very dangerous to society and an invitation to crime, or the risk to land title, where people say, well, maybe I don't own this property because maybe 10 years ago it was used for marijuana and the federal government might seize it. In the insurance area, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors is continuing to pursue insurance capital standards that seem incompatible with the U.S. system of state insurance regulation. And I hope that you would answer for the record how you will ensure that the U.S. state-based regulatory system will be protected in the negotiations. And I'll have another question for the record on mutual funds, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga, chairman of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am sure, Secretary Mnuchin, you are encouraged as well as I am by my colleagues' newfound concern with our debt situation, especially in light of a $1 trillion-plus deficit spending that had happened under the last administration on an annual basis. And I hope these same colleagues will have that same enthusiasm to tackle the entitlement situation that we have here, so we can actually have a safety net system that will exist for future generations. So that's where we need to focus and concentrate on. But I want to hit on a couple of things. One very briefly here on the Volcker rule. I need to take this opportunity as chair of that Capital Markets subcommittee to do that. Then I want to talk a little bit about China and our debt with China and some trade. So recently, last month, the Treasury announced that the 5 federal financial regulatory agencies dealing with Volcker had come together and had proposed some changes to ease compliance while still implementing Section 619 with the 60-day comment period. You said, quote, the 5 agencies responsible for regulation of the Volcker Rule coming together on this notice is an important first step. And I'm wondering, could you explain a little bit about how these reforms help address the Volcker Rule so that compliance can be streamlined, rules clarified, and markets can be made more efficient?
I think on the Volcker Rule, it's all about providing more clarity on and making sure that the appropriate people can properly execute the rule. So I think there was a lot of ambiguities. Some people refer to you should have a lawyer and a psychiatrist to interpret it. But this is about, we want to make sure it can be enforced, but it can be enforced clearly.
And what are the next steps Treasury is exploring to help appropriately tailor the Volcker Rule?
Well, this is now, we had a series of suggestions on this in the executive report, but this is now being led by the regulators and is being executed by them.
Turning to China, obviously China has a very large chunk of our debt. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 trillion, $1.2 trillion that China directly controls. Do you have any sort of fear that they could use that as an alternative trade weapon? And if so, are there any kind of contingency plans that have been established as countermeasures if that were to happen?
Well, I would just comment to a large extent, a big component of the reason why they have that debt is because the giant trade deficit and then reinvesting that cash. I have no reason to believe that that's of a concern to the market at this point. The market is very liquid and has a lot of depth, but that's something we'll continue to monitor.
I appreciate that. Well, and I, like some of my colleagues, I know Mr. Barr and others have expressed their desire to push for better, fair trade deals. I would join that sentiment as well. But we do know that sometimes victory comes at a heavy price, and I wanted to explore a couple of things real briefly with this. I chair the U.S.-Canada IPG, the Interparliamentary Group. It's the official exchange between the U.S. Parliament and the U.S. House. And I can tell you our Canadian allies and friends, neighbors, trading partners are genuinely confused about why Section 232 was used to designate some of the tariffs on that. And what are you telling your colleagues internationally about this?
I've had very direct conversations with many of my colleagues on this, specifically the Canadians. I don't want to go in detail in this setting, but I can assure you we've had very detailed discussions. I am on my way to Mexico tomorrow with Secretary Pompeo, and obviously NAFTA is a big focus now that there's the elections there.
I'd like to maybe explore this offline with you, and while I commend the goal, I'm afraid that there may be some actions trying to recapture a world that frankly no longer exists. The largest trading partnership in the world is U.S. and Canada. The 6th largest trading partnership in the world is the state of Michigan in Canada, a lot of that surrounding autos, office furniture, and agriculture. And what we are seeing here is an integrated supply system that has parts for vehicles traveling back and forth across the border, sometimes 9 different times, and thousands of parts doing that. So we have to be very careful with that, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, ranking member of our Capital Markets Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary Mnuchin. The last time you testified, I asked you about beneficial ownership, and you said you wanted more time to look at it. I think it's a critical challenge before our country. I introduced a bill at the request of really law enforcement that said they would track money and terrorism and drugs and guns and hit an LLC and not know who owned it. They just want to know who owns it so that they can protect us better. And the best time to do it is when they are filing. We have a bill in. Many of us in a bipartisan way are supporting it, that this information would be available to Treasury, kept at state level if they so wished, and also law enforcement. And I live in a city, New York, that continually faces terrorist threats, and there are no threats unless there's financing. So cracking down on terrorism financing is critical, and I now want to know that since you've had a chance to look at this, and in light of the testimony that the FinCEN director gave recently, that he believed companies should be required to disclose their beneficial owners at the time that they are formed and they are a part of Treasury. So I'd now like to ask you if you've had a chance to look at this and what is your feeling now on supporting beneficial ownership and having this information available to Treasury and to law enforcement.
So first of all, let me just say I fully support that it is a very important issue, and we need to be able to figure out an efficient and prudent way that we have access to beneficial ownership. I wish I could tell you I already had this solved. We are having a lot of discussions. We look forward to continuing this discussion with you and members of the committee to find a solution. We need an appropriate solution to this.
Well, thank you. And as you know, our committee has been discussing legislation to reform the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering rules. And I believe that any legislative package on this issue must address the issue of beneficial ownership, because anonymous shell companies are routinely used to finance criminal and terrorist organizations. So do you believe that a legislative package to strengthen our anti-money laundering rules should address the use of anonymous shell companies by criminals and terrorist organizations?
As I've said, I believe this issue needs to be solved, whether it's solved as part of BSA or whether it's solved separately. These are both very important issues, but we do need to be able to have access to beneficial ownership information for law enforcement and for combating terrorist financing.
Well, also in February, Treasury, you released a report recommending that we keep Dodd-Frank's orderly liquidation authority for winding down large financial institutions as an emergency option. And I agree with you, and I want to thank you for that report. The report also recommended changes to the orderly liquidation authority, and if there are changes that need to be made, I think we should have that discussed, because I strongly oppose repealing this authority. Can you discuss why you think, as your report stated, that the authority is a far preferable alternative to destabilizing financial contagion or ad hoc government restructuring or bailouts?
So I think, as you know, this is an issue we reviewed very carefully, and we do support keeping it. I look forward to speaking with you about some of the specifics of the changes that we would recommend. They would require legislation.
Thank you. I look forward to those discussions. And finally, as chairman of the